And we're live. I really need to stop doing that. It has my voice. Anyway, good evening to those...
Live.
Oh, Jesus Christ, it's in my ears. Oh, I really need to stop doing that. Anyway, tonight we're going to be doing a review of Prime Minister's questions from yesterday. It was a bit cancerous. And as the thumbnail suggests, yeah, it wasn't great. Although the unparliamentary thing actually happened shortly after PMQs, which we're not going to be able to cover today. But I might talk about it now. You see, there are procedures in place in Parliament where certain documents are given to the opposition on Opposition Day, which is typically Wednesday. So when reports are read out by the government in Parliament, they have, typically, within an hour of giving that speech, give a copy of it to the opposition so that they can then dissect it and create a suitable rebuttal. Well, Chris Grayling, the Transport Secretary, failed miserably, and he has a track record of doing this. In fact, Chris Grayling is a bit of a snobbish fuck. He's as bad as Jeremy Hunt, the Health Minister. But Grayling's is different because he makes excuses. And with his excuses, they typically centre around discretion. Unfortunately, with what's going on currently with public transport and Labour's push to get us to well, I say us, not us, the government, to get the government to renationalise the majority of the railway lines, because the government has had to bail out on a number of occasions companies like Virgin, who have failed to provide adequate services to customers. Not just them though. I believe South Eastern Rail, South Western Rail, Greater Anglia Rail, although that at one point was called something else. Having used the Greater Anglia Rail service a lot when I used to go from Norwich down to where I am here, although it was different halfway. And I also used to have to get a tube from where was it? Liverpool Street to Charing Cross. So I had to get a tube to Tottenham Court Road and then switch over. But it was a bit of a nightmare. Thankfully, high-speed rail makes it so you only have to go to Stratford now and then get the high-speed rail from there to where I am. In any case, they've been bailed out on a number of occasions, and because Grayling did not provide adequate reasoning, the Speaker did in fact call him out for it. Because the Speaker's job is to make sure that proceedings go correctly in the parliamentary fashion, and this is one of those times where Grayling failed miserably, but he keeps doing it. So it's kind of one of those things where you have to wonder, what can you do to punish people suitably for it. Debuler was timed out by disconnect. Oh dear, oh no. Well, anyway, we'll get into PMQs in a second. So hello Davey, W.R. Corsten, Any Jake, Discanar, Laura. A Metacooler, is there a Liberal Party in any better? The Liberal Democrats are an all but annihilated party. They're going to take many years to be great again. Unfortunately, the Liberal Democrats in 2010 formed a coalition with the Conservatives. Some of their policies were enacted, raising the tax bill from $6,000 a year to $10,000, although it was a gradual thing, it went to $9,000 I think first. It was great. But the Liberal Democrats originally got in by appealing to students when they said they would vote against raising the tuition fees, which had to be done because the government was subsidising further education. Unfortunately, with austerity, cuts had to be made, and that was one of them. And they lost the majority of their seats. So yeah, not great. Hello, TCA. Right, so all that aside, no one told him we weren't supposed to eat the bag. Yes. Anyway, the focus of today's Prime Minister's questions is predominantly Brexit and Cabinet related, and there are quite a number of sources for this, but as with previous ones, I can't be jaffed to pull them all up on screen, so I'll just read from them when I have to. Although there is another video clip we get later on, I think. Oh, I have to try and remember when that was. Doesn't matter. Let's just start.
Jeremy Corbyn! Yeah!
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for welcoming PC Wright and PC Nichols to this chamber today. They did great work, as indeed police officers do all over the country, and it's right that you should recognise them on behalf of all of us. It is Mental Health Awareness Week this week.
This doesn't get talked about anywhere near as much as it should do. Not even a joke. Parliament doesn't really talk about it. They just mention it in passing at best.
Mr. Speaker, and I join the Prime Minister in wishing Harry and Meghan all the best, and thank Harry for the work that he's done in highlighting the need to challenge the stigma surrounding mental health,
so
and the
annoying.
ability of all of us to talk about mental health to ensure that people don't suffer in silence on their own, particularly young people who are often so grievously affected by this.
I bet if anyone tweeted directly to him, I have a mental health issue, would you like to talk to me? Can I talk to you about it? I bet you'd get blocked by him. Oh, okay, maybe that's a bit too far. He probably does care enough, but his assistants wouldn't actually let him reply. Sorry, carers.
Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister wrote at the weekend that she wanted as little friction as possible, was she talking about EU trade or the next cabinet meeting?
Okay, this is actually pretty funny. I tend to think that's quite funny. It's a good one, well scripted. But it is a waste of a question. I can't be the only person that thought that. I know when Irate Bear he direct messaged me on Twitter about this and said that this was funny, and I agree. Yawn. But it is a waste. I know that he also sent me something on the new laws being introduced about 7 years for certain types of abuse, and just before PMQs, they were talking about it in Parliament about dealing with abuse some get. But it's become a recurring theme where it hasn't actually gone any further than simply talking about it momentarily. Oh, and to address the chat, Jeremy Corbyn would never be knighted because it took so long for him to even kneel before the Queen to kiss the ring to become a member of the, what's it called? Council, I think. It's basically like a secret meeting where people, talk about the very top secret shit. I can't remember the name of it. It doesn't matter.
I think the right honourable gentleman knows full well that this government has a policy of leaving the customs union, and of ensuring that as we do so, we have as frictionless trade as possible with the EU, that we have a solution which ensures we have no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and also that we have an independent trade policy.
Before she continues, yes, thank you, Davey. It is the Privy Council. Hello, Rick. What was it? Balls. I've completely forgotten what I was going to say. Sigh. Doesn't matter. There was something, and I know I'm going to remember later, and it's going to piss me off.
But if he's talking about friction, perhaps he could reflect on the fact that this month the Shadow Health Minister in the Lords voted for a second referendum.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I can't remember what I was going to say, but she's going to mention 3 members of the Shadow Cabinet who have all called for second referendums. With the Labour Shadow Cabinet, their positions on this are actually a little bit because none of them have stood behind or respected the vote to an extent. I mean, they'll say they respect the will of the people, but they keep calling for us to essentially stay in the EU. So the Shadow Health Minister is Lord Hunt, and I'll be honest, he for a while has been calling for a second referendum. Okay, so there was a Labour peer-backed amendment to the EU withdrawal bill, which would give voters the chance to either rubber stamp the final Brexit deal or reverse the UK's exit from the EU. It was The proposals, though, were tabled while by the Liberal Democrats. They were rejected 202 to 260 by the Lords. 51 Labour peers defied the party's order to abstain and back the plans, which include Lord Hunt, who currently serves on the opposition front bench. So yeah, he's one. There's two more, though, and we'll get to those in a second, because this is quite amusing. Where's the video? Ah, there it is. Stupid tabs.
That at the weekend, the Shadow Brexit Secretary refused to rule out a second referendum.
This was, I believe... Oh, hang on, I've got the link for that as well. It was on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday, so I can't play that. But when he was asked if the party supported the public being given an opportunity to reverse last year's vote and remain in the bloc, the Shadow Brexit Secretary would only say that Labour hasn't called for a referendum. The full quote is, "We've never called for a referendum, a second one. We are focusing on what the new agreement needs to look like." Basically, he's being indecisive and political as shit. Also, I find it interesting, Keir Starmer's, I think his full title is Sir Keir Starmer. I'm quite surprised that somebody with that particular title would be in the Shadow Cabinet. It's almost as if Labour choose on, what suits them rather than standing to principle, because, let's face it, Corbyn does not like the Lords, and he certainly doesn't respect things related to the Queen. Hello, Tiger Lily. And hello again. Oh, Dibula. Oh, dear. Yeah, right, I think there's one more politician he mentions. She mentions, so we'll get to that, and then... Yeah.
And on Monday, the Shadow International Development Minister tweeted in favour of a second referendum.
Yeah, I tried to find this tweet, and I've linked her Twitter below. But she deleted the tweet. The tweet does not exist anymore. I wish it did. And the lack of response from the opposition bench on this tells me that this might be true, because usually they shout things down when it's a bit controversial. But I've trawled through her Twitter. Kate Ossamore, who looks like a cliche token black woman in the cabinet. I do want to touch her hair, though, to be fair. Just to piss her off, mostly, though. And there's no tweet referencing it, so I think that might be true. Dear oh dear. Anyway, let's continue. Oh, fucking hell, my mouse. I need to buy a new mouse. Yeah, I'm gonna get a new one later. Maybe next week, who knows. Let's continue.
So perhaps when he stands up, he could put the minds of the British people in this House at rest and rule out a second referendum.
There have been times in the last 6 months where Corbyn has sacked members in his cabinet, or people have stood down, of course, resigned from the Shadow Cabinet anyway. And he did to one who said that the British people should have a say on the final deal. There was one that said it. Northern Irish Secretary, I think, maybe. I can't remember the bloody name. I mentioned it in one of my PMQs anyway. Not long after, Diane Abbott supported this on Twitter, this notion. Now, obviously, Corbyn's not going to get rid of the woman he used to fuck. But people in his cabinet have vocally said this. Of course, she probably got reamed for it, and he probably enjoyed it. She probably enjoyed it. All that white oppression. In any case, there's a bit of an inconsistency, not just with the current cabinet, but also with the Shadow Cabinet, who have been caught out. Both have been caught out on multiple times, not being consistent on their party's position. The difference is, and there is a big difference, whereas the Shadow Cabinet, they're kind of mysterious in a way. You can't quite tell who actually holds that position fully. With the current cabinet, the Conservative Party government, we know exactly what everyone supports. We know it. They wear their hearts on their sleeves on this one, which makes all the friction in their current cabinet meetings obvious and good, because then we know they're going to argue all this from positions of people who support both Remain and Leave, which is a good thing, because it keeps the government honest. Jeremy Corbyn! Oh, okay. Constibula, a shadow cabinet. It's basically the opposition. So the current government is the cabinet. The white-haired man opposite is the opposition leader. The whole side of that cabinet, with the benches on his side, they're not all opposition. They're different parties as you go further to the right. But Labour, which is his party, the white-haired man, he's the opposition. He's Labour. The government traditionally sits on the side nearest us. And shadow cabinet, they basically take up roles fulfilled by cabinet members, but obviously they're the ones keeping the government supposedly honest on those policies that they generate. They also, though, have access to legal documentation typically called white papers, or speeches being given in cabinet, so that they can then refute, debunk, critique in Parliament and debate, obviously, over legislation that is being proposed by the government. Hello, Sir Zophiel. I hope this helps, by the way. And basically, Rick is correct. It's sounds like something out of Mordor. Although Davy's actually quite right, and I should have just gone with what he said.
Mr. Speaker, the divisions in the Cabinet mean there's been no progress in negotiations for 5 months.
Citation needed.
The reality is the Cabinet is more interested in negotiating with each other than it is with the European Union.
Citation needed, but also at the same time, them negotiating with each other isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just saying. It just sounds like they have discussions. That's not... It's complicated. I think most of you get that. It's a good thing that people don't agree wholeheartedly on everything.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's promise of as little friction as possible is in stark contrast with the earlier commitment that it would be friction-free.
Okay, the friction-free remark, I have a source on that. Okay, so this was back in January of 2017, when Theresa May set out a goal of a friction-free trading relationship, where I believe she set out a strategy where she hinted Britain could leave the European Customs Union, stating she wanted frictionless cross-border trade but had an open mind on whether it should be done through associate membership or a new agreement. I remember what I was going to say earlier. No, I don't. Oh, don't leave my fucking head now. Right, yes, no, I remember. There was a... whenever the government is constantly being railed on and questioned and argued at from the position that they are making things difficult about borders, about trade, they're not the ones making the rules. The rules are set by the other side. They've got their rules in place, and then they have to negotiate with us to agree terms with them. But we obviously want different rules, so it's kind of a case that some certain policies have to either be bent by one side or the other. We do not want a closed border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, so we are not going to be the ones that enforce that. The EU will. We obviously want control over immigration, so border checks to an extent, because obviously we don't want illegal immigration to skyrocket. We don't want people just coming here willy-nilly. We want control. We are not the ones training up staff for border checks. That, as you yourself mentioned later, Jeremy Corbyn, would be the Netherlands. You do realise I watch Ren Misa live streams. I see one of yours dead stop, even if it is this dry material. Right. You troll away, Zophiel. In any case, we, the United Kingdom, are not the ones who are trying to impose all these things that we are supposedly imposing. It is the EU imposing them, and we are trying to negotiate them relaxing them. And that would include the Northern Ireland-Irish border, the trade issues, but the trade is an ongoing issue. That is going to dominate this year. Trade is the big one. Kind of. In any case, it's not as he is fobbing it off as. So I just wanted to make it quite clear there's a bit of dishonesty there. So let's continue.
So could the Prime Minister explain how much friction she is willing to accept?
Oh, that sounds sexual. I don't like that.
Businesses and workers in those companies...
I like that he's trying to make this sound as serious as possible, but come on.
...need to know.
I say to the right honourable gentleman that we want to ensure that we are able to continue to trade in a...
This is what you're about to hear is a statement that has been repeated at least 2, maybe 3 dozen times over the last 3 to 4 weeks. It is quite annoying now that I have to keep hearing Theresa May say this same shit.
Frictionless a way as possible, and the suggestion that trade at the moment is entirely frictionless is actually not correct. But we have set 3 very simple objectives for a future customs union. Now, I will say to this House that achieving those objectives, which I've just set out, is not easy. It is difficult. There will be some who will say, actually forget about an independent...
I think with the whole friction jokes, as I feel, it's best we don't think of it as wet.
...trade policy. That is not the position of this government. There may be some who say, don't worry about the Northern Irish border. That is not the position of this government.
Essentially reinforcing my earlier remarks about this government not being the ones imposing certain rules for borders, checks, and nonsense like that.
It is absolutely right that we are aiming to achieve those 3 objectives. And when he talks about progress, we'll be publishing a white paper in a few weeks which will show how much progress we are making on these issues.
Right. I had to look this up because I didn't know for a long time what it was. Basically, and this is from the UK Parliament website, white papers are policy documents produced by the government that set out their proposals for future legislation. They are often published as command papers and may include a draft version of a bill that is being planned. This provides a basis for further consultation and discussion with interested or affected groups and allows final changes to be made before a bill is formally presented to Parliament. You're all welcome. I had to look that up because for a while, to me it just sounded like somebody was going to come down the road or the corridor, just give them a sheet of plain A4 and be like, there's your white paper. It's very racist. Just saying. What's going on in the chat? Omegon's going in dry to race. Oh God.
Well, Mr. Speaker, they're no nearer to agreeing a white paper than they are on the strategy for going forward.
Citation needed. Most of it, I know that this obviously stems from the very well-known discussions about different types of customs partnerships. Yes, I know that. But I don't think that's enough of a basis to form any kind of argument against the government's current negotiations.
I would remind the Prime Minister that the UK is the slowest of all major economies and...
No one cares. Firstly, it's still growing. Second, and I have to draw on... I even went to the freaking the IMF. I went as far as to look through the World Economic Outlook database, right? And you can go back to 2015, okay? When you have annualized GDP growth, you have like the USA, UK, and France, okay? So in the first quarter of 2015, the UK had the highest growth, with France at the bottom and the USA just over 2% growth, okay? So you go ahead, right, one quarter, okay, in 2015. The UK is in the middle at just under 1%, USA at top, still just over 2%. France above them. No, the UK was at the bottom of in that quarter. Okay, so France was just above them. But then you go across the quarters and you go up to like the end of the year for 2015. Okay, France and the US at the bottom with 1%, and the UK just under 3%. Okay, these are zigzag lines. Go to 2016 and then to 2017. Okay, you go to mid Q2, so the second quarter of 2016. France negative growth. USA 1.5% and the UK 2.3% growth. But then you go to Q3, UK stays around there, the USA skyrocketed to just over 3% and France is at 1%. Okay, the year finished out with France at just under 1%. Sorry, the USA just under 1%. UK and France at 1% GDP. These are three of the biggest economies in the world. Three of them. And they zigzagged so much, it was inconsistent as fuck. You cannot form an argument against growth at the moment, because we're still growing, and yes, while we are the slowest in this, we are also... Even Germany was equal with us at one point, at 1.8%. I'm sorry, but this is not... It's not a consistent position to argue, because the growth rates continue to fluctuate. There's no stable growth. And I know this is a position of Labour, where they seem to base a lot of things on economies being endless growth. They seem to think that's... But based on this, we're still growing. It's still economic growth, but it's just not... It's not as big. That's it. It's still growing, though. And at the moment, we're still one of the most powerful... We have one of the most powerful cities in the world. London is, as far as economic hubs go, I think it's one of, if not the most powerful. China and USA probably have us beat on that, I guess, with New York and whatever it is in China, some commie city, no doubt. Corbyn would love it there, if it was just a little more Russian. In any case, it's not a good position to hold. The IMF confirms that. And I'm going to delete those fucking tabs. Yeah, so let's continue with whatever it was we were doing. Oh yeah, the economic growth thing. Just, it's not a solid position.
And slower than the Eurozone in growth as a whole.
So what?
Uncertainty and recklessness of government is putting jobs and investment at risk.
That's quite true, Dibs. I just wanted to point out that the argument about our growth and then the growth of other nations, when he talks about us in the G7 having the lowest, but the growth rates continually changing, show trends. That it's just, and the trend being it is absolutely uncertain. It's never certain, even with us leaving the EU, it wasn't certain before the referendum, was it? It was constantly in flux.
Last week, Airbus confirmed their space contract will move abroad post-Brexit. And the company has gone on to say it's considering its overall position in the UK because of the government's complete lack of clarity. How many other businesses have warned the Prime Minister that they too are considering their future in this country?
I know where he's going to go with this, so I will say now that Theresa May doesn't adequately answer this question because he will somewhat debunk it. And I did a little digging. There are some companies... but most of the excuses they give are centred around the border checks and not around any reasonable position about the economy. I really need to get it into my head, economy or economy. I need to stop doing that. And to Zozophil, flattery will get you everywhere.
The Right Honourable Gentleman talks about preparations in the negotiations and the White Paper. Let's just remember what his position was.
Right, yes. She's about to say it's because he... Right, I'll let her say it, but I actually have a video clip for that. So, what I'm going to do... Where's that? This, as you can tell, is from the truest moment where everyone knew heaven was real because this happened. And if you notice at the bottom there, 7:28 a.m. Okay, at 7:28 I had just arrived at work. I did not know the result because I'd forgotten to look for it. I had 3 hours sleep. It wasn't until 8:15 I remembered and I checked my phone. And I was in a pub at the time because it's one of the contracts I have. And I remember jumping around that place like a madman. I really wanted to go up to one of the whiskey taps. Not taps, the pourer things. I don't know what they're called. Pourer thing. I don't know. I was going to get a drink. I really wanted to at 8:15. I wanted a drink. I wanted to celebrate. I was so happy. But yes, we're going to have a little quote. I think it's like a minute long. Okay, the video is 9 minutes, but we're only going to cover the first minute. So that should help here.
Mr. Corbyn, thank you very much for coming here. Good morning. You famously said during this campaign you were 7.5 out of 10 in favour of remaining. Now you're 2.5. The 2.5 side of your intellect has won, and the 7.5 has been abandoned. How do you see the future now? Are you an enthusiastic Brexiter now?
Well, the British people have made their decision. We must respect that result, and Article 50 has to be invoked now so that we negotiate an exit from the European Union. I think a lot of the message that's come back from this is that many communities are fed up with cuts they've had, fed up with economic dislocation.
Not entirely true, but sure, continue.
And feel very angry at the way they've been betrayed and marginalised.
Don't use austerity as a scapegoat. That's my main point from what he's been saying.
By successive governments in very poor areas of the country, and my point throughout the campaign was that we had to have an alternative to austerity. We had to have greater resources going into areas where there's been huge changes, and I strongly called for the introduction of a migrant impact fund as well as proper funding of local authorities. The results obviously are different across the country, different between densely populated urban areas and other parts of the country. We now have to try and protect the working conditions that we have in this country, and in the negotiations with the European Union try to obviously ensure there are some trade opportunities for Britain, because clearly there are some very difficult days ahead. The value of the pound has already fallen,
which stabilised not long after,
and there will therefore be job consequences as a result of this decision.
Anyway, that's the full context. His belief is that Article 50 should be invoked immediately, which was a mistake to say. As far as I'm concerned, it needs to be invoked. Well, we needed time, and I know that there is a 10-hour stream, and I've watched it a few times, because I'm one of those people whenever I feel low, what I really like to do is watch something I was actually involved in, and that's Brexit. And it's one of the only very, very few political things I've ever been involved in, and voted on especially. I watched that referendum result night to cheer myself up. I think only once during that entire night did the Remain team take the lead, and boy was it short-lived. But watching some of the discussions and how they responded when the results were finalised, it was quite interesting because they were also very calm, except for one guy who was very upset. But it was very interesting. Anyway, up to the chat, let's have a look. Fallacious nonsense yet. Fatby, even though can't depict it's so much better. Yeah, I tried to stay up and watch it, but I had work at 6 AM as well as I feel, so I didn't have an option. I passed out. I just could not keep my eyes open. Let's close that tab. Right. Back to this.
His position.
The chuntering.
His position was that we should have triggered Article 50 immediately after the referendum, with no work having been done in preparation for the negotiations. He wouldn't even have had a white page, let alone a white paper, to base his negotiations on. And what would that have led to? What Labour do every time in government? They'd have sold Britain out.
I'm not going to be drawn too much onto that, but generally speaking, Labour governments haven't done particularly well when it comes to us and the European Union. Just saying. Not that the Conservatives are that much better. Let's face it, Major and Cameron did pretty piss poor in negotiating.
Jeremy Corbyn! The problem is, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's own position isn't even supported by her cabinet.
Not position, idea put forward. Get it right.
Rolls-Royce have said, Mr. Speaker, Rolls-Royce, we're worried about border checks. We need to be thoughtful and careful about future investments. Ford.
Rolls-Royce are considering moving their entire operation to Germany because of it, which is remarkably petty. But I will say, I can understand the uncertainty, because the government can't put out too much information while they're still negotiating trade stuff. They can't do it yet. So the uncertainty, it just seems like a preemptive thing. It also seems really silly to not trust the government. But then again, I find it fascinating that a communist, is defending businesses when he doesn't give a fuck about them. He can talk about defending workers' rights with unions, yeah, but the businesses, he doesn't give a fuck about them. He doesn't understand them, he doesn't know how they work. And also it's capitalism, he doesn't like capitalism. Anyway.
Any sort of border restrictions and customs friction is going to be an inhibitor to us continuing. Vauxhall, we cannot continue to invest in a world of uncertainty.
Oh, business scaremongery 101. Yeah. Like anyone gives a fuck. We no, carry on.
Mr. Speaker, businesses are understandably frustrated by this government. This week, the Environment Secretary gave his view on the Prime Minister's preferred customs partnership model. He said there have to be significant question marks over the deliverability of it on time.
Right. Yeah, so I think I have something for this as well. Article 50 has to revoke now. Brexit news, Rolls-Royce. Right, so he was talking about Michael Gove. And this is in reference to, I believe, he was also on the Andrew Marr show, wasn't it? He indicated he has some sympathy for the Foreign Secretary who called the proposal crazy, which Corbyn is about to reference. And in the context, to give a quote from that also, and it was on the Andrew Marr show, the quote for the crazy thing. Because it's novel, because no model like this exists, there have to be significant questions about the deliverability of it on time. More than that, the NCP New Customs Partnership requires the British government to, in effect, act as the tax collector and very possibly the effective deliverer of regulation for the EU. So it kind of gives more context to the fact that Corbyn has said, obviously pointed out that he is he said there's significant question marks, but also about the remark he's about to give about what Boris said about it being crazy, because it is important that this is given a suitable context.
As it has flaws. Well, at least he didn't call it crazy like the Foreign Secretary.
Context.
But, Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister...
They just love Boris. Or to some Americans, apparently that's Donald Trump.
Minister cannot even convince her own cabinet of her strategy, what chance does she have of convincing 27 other European countries?
Firstly, and I forgot to mention this, Theresa May hasn't actually answered many of the questions. Second, she doesn't have to convince the other countries. No. The deal is agreed upon in the negotiations. The respective parties then present it to the respective parliaments. It is not up to Theresa May to convince the 27 other countries. That's on whichever dickhead is arguing with David Davis.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that he has taken this view of our position in negotiations before. Before December he said we wouldn't get a joint report, and we did. Before March he said we wouldn't get an implementation period, and we did. And we continue to negotiate. But if he's asking about what British businesses are doing, I'll tell you...
To address the chat, subjective about the beauty part. And for a long time, myself and others wanted Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister, because him and Trump would be fantastic together. Not even a joke. But he was stabbed in the back by the Environment Secretary Michael Gove, who's a bit of a dickhead.
What British businesses are doing.
Oh, and that's why we have Theresa May instead. It would have been Boris Johnson. Honestly, Boris Johnson would have won.
They're creating more jobs in this country. Record levels of employment in this country. What did we see under Labour? 500,000 more people unemployed. Because Labour governments always leave office with more people out of work than when they went in.
I actually went to dig some digging on previous Labour governments. I don't want to be that guy, but Theresa May is correct. Not to say there is much of an improvement in certain conservative governments, but the records are pretty bad. Sorry, Labour. I'm starting to think that you as a party chose the name ironically. You're basically the OG hipsters at this point.
Jeremy Corbyn! Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on record numbers of 0 hours?
Eldritch Lisa. You think his voice went squeaky? It did. Later, you're going to think he sounds like he's got a sinus infection. It's going to get very nasally.
Contracts.
The 0 hour contracting isn't entirely true. I'll pull it back slightly so you actually get the full context.
What did we see under Labour?
Sorry, you're going to have to listen to us again, but the full context.
500,000 more people unemployed, because Labour governments always leave office with more people out of work than when they went in.
Jeremy Corbyn! Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on record numbers of 0 hours contracts?
Right, so this is this actually is referenced in the people in employment on 0 hour contract from March 2017, and I think where's the bloody quote? There's a here we are. There's a section on how many no guaranteed hour contracts are there. The estimates from surveys, though, are due to sampling errors subject to a degree of uncertainty. So I would be very skeptical about any claims made about 0 hour contracts without sufficient proof, because this is from the Office of National Statistics, and even they say it has sampling errors, so it's not definitive or conclusive. It is inaccurate. That's also linked in the description. There's a lot of sources in the description for this shit. Anyway.
Record numbers of people in in-work poverty and
subjective again on the parameters for poverty. I talked about it last week. Labour's position on what poverty is and what the Conservatives are not the same. So the word poverty is losing meaning because of it. I would consider poverty to be living hand to mouth. If you're still working and living hand to mouth, then to an extent I'd agree poverty is accurate. But I guess it does come down to living costs. If you make under the taxable income, like myself, you could argue it is poverty to an extent, but I think the word poverty is quite strong, so I think it's more low income is the correct turn of phrase.
Record of wages lower today than they were 10 years ago. And can I also congratulate the Prime Minister on formally dividing her cabinet into rival camps, as if
that's been divided ever since she formed it, and she had no choice. She didn't stand a chance without Boris there. Boris and Gove are far too popular. They have far too much sway with the Leave members as well, but also Leave voters. So she's always going to have a divisive cabinet, and you're no better, Corbyn. Okay. The only difference is you have the semi-bottle to get rid of the ones that you haven't slept with. Or you certainly had teething problems in 2015 when you first stepped up. Do you remember? All those people that kept leaving you to the point where Cameron even said, for heaven's sakes, man, go, and you didn't. Now, granted, you weathered the storm, but you lost so much support. And your party is so far left these days. Honestly.
It needed doing to look at two different models, and as a process, Mr. Speaker, of parliamentary scrutiny, I hope both subcommittees will be reporting directly to this House so we can all make up our minds on the rival factions in our own cabinet.
Yeah, that argument comes from the whole unparliamentary thing I referenced at the start. Yeah. Hello, Trups.
Mr. Speaker, whilst her government dithers, the Dutch government has now begun training the first batch of extra customs officials to...
This is where I point out that we haven't been doing that, but everyone else is. The EU bloc is doing it, not us. kind of supports the whole point that, you know, we're not the ones who are imposing these ridiculous rules in place, but they are.
To deal with the reintroduction of customs checks for British goods at Dutch borders. In October, the Prime Minister's official spokesperson said HMRC were...
Order! The right...
This is a very, very long question, if you noticed. Corbyn has been going on for a while. So I get why the speakers had to intervene on the part about the chantering, gesticulating, the shouting. But at the same time, Corbyn has gone on for a long time.
The Honourable Gentleman will complete his question more quickly if members don't shout for order! Order! Mr Clark, I don't require your assistance. You're an amiable enough fellow, but no assistance by the chair from you is required. I want to accommodate backbenchers, and I will do so today, as I always do. I'm concerned about people who want to ask questions. If people don't want to ask questions, shush and listen. And if you do want to ask questions, you'd certainly better keep stum. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a very straightforward question. How many HMRC additional staff have been recruited in order to deal with Brexit?
This is a very specific question, and it's going to lead on to a discussion about HMRC budget cuts. Yeah, and Theresa May doesn't answer it, so I'm just going to let her say her piece, because she's not going to answer the question.
Prime Minister.
The Right Honourable Gentleman, as he knows, we are indeed making preparations for all contingencies. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has announced money which has been allocated to departments to make those necessary preparations. But can I just correct him on what he said at the beginning of his question? Because at the beginning of his question, he referred to 0 hours contracts. In fact, if we look at the increase in employment, almost 2/3 of the rise in employment in the last year has been from full-time work. Over 3/4 of the growth in employment since 2010 has been in full-time work, and around 70% of the rise in employment since 2010 has come from high-skilled work. So perhaps when he stands up, he will welcome the jobs that have been created under this government.
Just the thing, all those statistics come from the Office of National Statistics, and I dig them up. They are correct. But the 0-hour contract thing, I've firmly stood against that for years. Having been subject to one back in 2011, they are very stressful. And I think this might be his last question. And I'm just going to say now, this isn't a question, and this is an absolute waste. And this is the second time in 3 weeks, I think. Or was it 4? Second time in the last month where he does something. And it's amusing. It's also amusing to hear what he says from a guy that is so weak.
Mr Speaker, the question I asked the Prime Minister was how many more HMRC officials have been recruited. She hasn't answered it. Can I help her to say that the claims that they're recruiting more won't even make up for the cuts made in the last 8 years? It seems that the Dutch government is more prepared for dealing with Brexit than the British government is.
Did you hear the nasally sound to his voice? It reminded me of Arkwright from Open All Hours. You'd have to be very British to understand that.
Mr Speaker, we've had 23 months since the referendum. We have just 10 months to complete negotiations, and the government is in complete disarray. On both sides of the negotiation...
He loves dramatic narratives, doesn't he? Always with the dramatic narratives on his final, quotes, question.
The reality is dawning that deadlines are at risk of not being met. More and more jobs are at risk as more and more businesses openly consider the options of relocating their jobs elsewhere. The government is so busy.
I think the reason this is panned over here is because of the white-haired guy at the back. It's David Davis. He's the negotiating guy for us.
Busy negotiating with itself, it cannot negotiate with anybody else. Absolutely. Mr Speaker, if the Prime Minister cannot negotiate a good deal for Britain...
Oh dear, oh dear. Right, hang on, I'm just going to prep myself mentally for what he's about to say. So, it's a drum roll. Yeah, yeah.
Why doesn't she step aside and let Labour negotiate a progressive new customs union and living standards backed by trade unions and business in this country. Step aside and make way for those who will.
Oh dear God. What a twat. To hear resignation comments, or step aside and stand down comments from a guy who wasn't that long ago told that he should leave as well, is hilarious. And it's the second time in the last month he has said this. Not just the Prime Minister, but also to Amber Rudd. Granted, she did, and she fucked up, so she deserved to. But this, it's such a waste. It really is, Corbyn. You have so many. You get 6 questions, and you had her on 3 of them because she didn't answer them. But the first and the last one were absolutely pitiful.
What a catastrophe that would be.
What a catastrophe that would be. I love that.
Mr. Speaker, what we have seen under this government is more jobs being created, more high-paid jobs being created. We have seen us delivering on our December joint report on Brexit and on a March report with the implementation period. But let's actually look to see what we would see from the Labour Party. Because from Labour, you simply cannot trust a word that they say. They said they'd strike new trade deals. But what do they want? They want to be in a customs union that ensures they could not strike new trade deals.
Also, they want to nationalise transport. The railways, right? And this is funny because I didn't know this until I was watching the Chris Grayling thing I mentioned at the beginning, which happened after PMQs. Because if we nationalised rail, it would, under EU law, be illegal. We would not be allowed to nationalise public transport because under EU law it's illegal, which is a position that would then be untenable, and yet a position the Labour Party hold. I think that's fun. I think that's funny and fantastic.
Promise broken. They said that they would scrap student debt, yet after the election they went back on that. Promise broken. They said they would tackle anti-Semitism. Promise broken.
Not just broken. They instead tried to scapegoat it as a not as big an issue as it is, or it being blown out of proportion issue. How about this? How about you just deal with the issue and make it very public? Publicly show you are doing something about it instead of continually saying and that's basically it. Basically, Labour's position is no better than them saying, as an argument for anti-Semitism, rabble, 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 rabble.
It is only the Conservative Party that can be trusted by the British people to deliver a Brexit that is in the interests of British people, to deliver opportunity for all and a Britain that is fit for the future.
Right, so before we finish, I'm going to go to SNP's questions. So, this is quite funny because obviously I don't have much in the way for respect for the SNP. And that will become very apparent with the first question.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House would wish to join me and wish Ramadan Mubarak to all Muslims who are preparing to start the month of Ramadan today. Mr. Speaker.
As long as no kids are being forced to starve themselves while at school like it has happened in the past, I don't give a shit.
Last night, the Scottish Parliament voted by 93 votes to 30, refusing to consent to the withdrawal bill.
Because they're little bitches. You and your Mickey Mouse Parliament need to be punished. Honestly, you and your Mickey Mouse Parliament would argue anything down that wasn't us then saying, okay, we'll just stay in because the teeny tiny minuscule and shitty little country of Scotland is like against us, and we can't have that because it's like a Yorkshire Terrier at your ankles, and that would be horrible, even though England could stomp on you shits. No one cares about Scotland. No one cares about your, quotes, democracy. And if you want to leave us, do it. Watch as your country crumbles around you.
The Scottish National Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens all voted to refuse consent.
This isn't like sex, okay? Is this EU withdrawal rape?
The Conservatives are isolated and out.
Because they are having to do what you can't do. Respect the will of the entire United Kingdom. The one thing you cannot do is accept that we are leaving. It's happening. Now, okay, you are a Scottish nationalist party. Yeah, fair enough. You only really invest yourself in the interests of your country. But your country is a part of a union, and the union voted to leave. Annoyingly, there aren't any members of Parliament, realistically, in the Labour Party, although there are maybe one or two, but they're so few that they don't represent their constituents. A number of whom have constituencies that voted to leave. Okay, the Conservative Party are having to hold the position of leave because that is the will of the people. You pathetic little fat shit. Oh, you're so annoying. India have failed, now they want... Yeah,
With the people of Scotland.
Fuck Scotland.
Will the Prime Minister respect the will of the Scottish Parliament and work with the Scottish...
No, because your Parliament is a Mickey Mouse building made of bamboo. Your politicians sit around playing on iPads all day. Your Parliament's set in a circular room with individual desks. And you look like... all of you look like dirty lesbians.
Government to amend the withdrawal bill.
No, your idea of amending the withdrawal bill is to say, we will not leave the EU. That's it. That's your position, not to leave. You won't respect the will of the people because you are only interested in the people of your country. This is why no one likes nationalist parties, because you're fucking stupid.
I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, we have been working with the Scottish Government for some time now, as we have been working with the Welsh Government on this issue. First of all, decisions that the devolved administrations are able to make before exit will continue to be able to...
I'm going to stop for a second. Blue-footed booby, why is... what was the question? Why is this fat prick on every PMQ? So what happens? The opposition, Labour, gets 6 questions. The second largest party get 2. Now, other backbenchers afterwards get a question each. Yes. But the Scottish National Party get to have 2 questions, and I want to give them a shot. Listening to them bleat on about Scotland's national interest and blah blah blah. It just pisses me off.
...to be made by them after exit. What the bill does is sets out a mechanism that respects devolution and lets us maintain the integrity of our own common market as we work out the long-term solutions. I think this is a reasonable, a sensible way forward. The Welsh Government and now the Welsh Assembly, including Labour and Liberal Democrat members of the Welsh Assembly, agree with that. I think it is right that we go ahead with measures which not only respect devolution, but also ensure that we maintain the integrity of our common market.
And Blackford!
Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister wishes to respect the Scottish Parliament, then the Prime Minister should respect the vote that took place.
She does respect the vote, but your vote as a part of a bloc lost. This is why the negotiating is so incredibly complex, because to respect the vote would mean to make some compromises that work for both parties. It's not going to happen though. The EU refusing to move on so much that we're being delayed. And quite frankly, shut the fuck up, you silly little fat prick. And yes, obviously, I totally love this guy, Stargazer.
Mr. Speaker, it is very simple. The Tories are seeking to veto the democratic wishes of the Scottish Parliament.
Which I'm okay with, honestly. You guys piss me off.
This is absolutely unprecedented. If this government forces through the legislation without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, the Prime Minister will be doing so in the full knowledge that they are breaking the 20-year-old devolution settlement.
Problem is, you won't agree to any. Sorry, you won't agree to anything. There's no version of it where you agree. There's no denying this, you fat little shit. I really should stop saying little and just call you a fat shit. There is no version of this where you, the fat shit, will agree. And that's because you are, while a supposedly democratic country, you're the same idiots that supported the Syrian airstrike shit on the chemical weapons facilities, which weren't chemical weapons facilities at all. Even though it was done in the face of repeatedly being vetoed by Russia. But you supported this shit. You supported that. The most undemocratic thing ever. So when it suited you, you were okay with it. But now, because it affects your precious little inclusive country, you're being a hypocrite. Unironically. I'm done with you. Fuck this shit. You bore me. Anyway, before I finish, does anyone have any questions about Prime Minister's questions? Because I figure I may as well give everyone a chance to ask me something. If there's anything relevant anyway. Punch your leg, it usually helps. No. Here's the settlement. We're leaving the EU. You can sit down and shut the fuck up. Yeah. I totally agree. I'm kind of irritated with the SNP. They always seem to be always doing something in Scotland's interests, and the problem with that is that they seem to then forget that the country is a part of a union, and interestingly they want to then leave this union and join another union. If they join that union, their vote will be worth even less than what it is in this country. So I find that quite fascinating. Alright, well, as there are no more questions, and I have concluded with, well, what I could be bothered with, quite frankly, it was quite tedious, I'm going to finish here. So I should hopefully be doing this again next week. If it's not on, obviously I will cover something else. But otherwise, I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and thank you all very much for listening.